Okay. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of an ethics overview for peer support specialist. I'm Carla Neely, and I'll be presenting this information with Foley Nash. These are confidentiality and disclosure agreements. We just covered all of this in part 1. So we're going to move ahead to our objectives for part 2. And part 2 of this presentation, our objectives will be the Code of Ethics for Louisiana Peer Support Specialists and a general model for ethical decision making. Part 1 is from the DHH Program Manual for Peer Support, pages 10 and 11, which we covered during part 1 of our presentation. And the second objective is the model found in the ACA code and an element missing from the Peer Support Specialist Code.
This is a paragraph taken directly from the American Counseling Association Code on Ethical Decision Making, which is section I of that code. And in the paragraph, you have a concise description of an ethical decision-making model that's recommended for counselors. It should include consultation, consideration of relevant ethical standards, principles, and laws, generation of potential courses of action, deliberation of risks and benefits, and selection of an objective decision based on the circumstances and welfare of all involved.
And an ethical decision-making model is especially important to peer support specialists who very often work as the only peer support at their places of employment. And because of this, peer support specialists often find consulting opportunities non-existent.
And this slide shows the first half, part 1 of the ethical decision-making model that we can apply to peer support specialists and their concerns from the American Counseling Association. Step 1 is to identify the problem and figure out what the ethical issue is that might be involved. Step 2 would be considering the relevant codes of ethics, the laws and the policies to identify what standards apply to this particular issue or problem, and which of the 6 moral or ethical principles is the one that or the several possibly that may take priority in this case. Is it non-maleficence? Is it beneficence? Is it justice? Is it fidelity? Any or all of those have potential to be involved in any ethical issue. Step 3 is, once you've done the identification and looked at the codes of ethics, laws, and policies, is to consult with colleagues, supervisors, experts, etc. And best practice, plan for consultation before the need. You don't want to be scrambling around to find somebody to consult with only after the ethical issue comes up. So your standard might be, what would another reasonable peer support specialist do? The second half of the decision-making model involves step 4, attending to the emotions in the situation. And that really involves, as we'll talk about in another section on transference and countertransference, not only the client's emotions, but your own as well. And item 5 is to involve your client as much as possible. That goes to autonomy, so that you're not making a decision that affects your client without having some input as much as possible from the client. Number 6, identify the desired outcomes and then generate some potential courses of action. And that's potential because you're generating multiple courses of action, and that allows you to consider the consequences of all of the possible options and decide on one course of action that you're actually going to select and follow. And then you would evaluate that particular course of action that you have selected for risk versus benefits. What are the pros, what are the cons if this action is taken? Some of the considerations involved in that would be such things as justice. Would I treat other people the same way? Publicity. Is it okay if this shows up in the 6 o'clock news? Would I want this reported in the press? Universality. Would I recommend this action to another peer support specialist in the same situation? And there's some moral traces there that may surface. What lingering feelings do I have of doubting this solution? Or what about it makes me uncomfortable? So once you've done that evaluation and decided where you're going to go, then you implement that course of action, follow up with documentation of your steps taken and your decision-making process, and then follow up with the aftermath of that decision. And here's some of the follow-up. In Louisiana, it's not only a best practice, but it's also a legal requirement to have proper record keeping. And some of those record keeping requirements are established by your agencies and other entities that are involved. So you'd want to document how you made your decision and document the fact that you consulted with people in order to arrive at that decision. And again, that legal standard is what a similarly trained professional would have done in the same situation. So if anything ever comes to a legal issue, then the review of what you did would be examined in the light of what other similarly trained people would have done with that situation. And of course, because this is ethics, we're looking at a consideration of risk. So one of the things that is necessary to have is a risk management toolkit that's really, really handy and accessible. And that may be on our next slide. And there we go. So it's a very good practice to have access to and awareness of the relevant codes of ethics. If you don't know what's in the code of ethics, it's really hard to follow it. You need to know what the state licensing and certification laws have to do with your work and any codes of conduct that might apply. There are also considerations with federal statutes, regulations, and how those are modified from time to time by case law with specific instances in which there have been rulings. So the fourth one in your toolkit would be helpful current publications. You can have articles about ethical decision-making. You can have a checklist. Insurance companies very often will provide a checklist for an ethical decision-making process or a set of steps. And you'll want in your toolkit a set of contact information for one or more local professionals that you can consult with, whether that would be other peers, maybe in other settings, clinical consultants like counselors, social workers, etc., attorneys, colleagues, etc. So all of those things are useful to have in your risk management toolkit. And a little more on consulting. Normally, if we're good at what we do, we believe that we're doing the right thing. Unfortunately, that's not always the case because we tend to do things and solicit information and take in information on the basis of something that's called confirmation bias. That's a tendency to either seek out or at least to accept more readily the viewpoints that we already agree with, or the ones that support our existing thinking. Because sometimes hearing things that we don't agree with makes us uncomfortable. One great value of consultation is that it lets us hear something besides our own thoughts. And a little more information on confirmation bias in our next slide. If I'm the cat in this, my confirmation bias is showing, because when I'm looking in the mirror, the reality of what I see is very different from the picture of myself that I'm painting off to the right. So that confirmation bias is going to give me a distorted self-portrait, just like this one in this slide. So that again is the great value of consultation. It lets us hear something besides our own thoughts. And sometimes the other viewpoint is really helpful because, as this indicates, a great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices. William James, one of the founding fathers of psychology. The other viewpoint from consulting allows us, sometimes it allows and sometimes it actually pushes us to get away from finding reasons to accept what we already think, that confirmation bias, and it keeps us from reinforcing our own prejudices of thought.
This concludes part 2 of our presentation. Again, we've included references in our contact information for further reading and in case you have any questions or comments. Thank you for joining us.